Hi, second grade students. Today's story is from Knowledge 9, Lesson 2, called Harriet Tubman, Part 2. Before I begin our story, I'm going to go over our vocabulary words. Our first vocabulary word for today's story is the word conductor. Repeat after me. Conductor. A conductor is a person who led or directed enslaved Africans to freedom during the Civil War by use of the Underground Railroad. Our next vocabulary word is the word passengers. Say passengers. Passengers are enslaved Africans who traveled to freedom on the Underground Railroad. Our last vocabulary word is the word rebellious. Say rebellious. Rebellious means resisting the control of someone else. The summer air was hot and heavy. There was no breeze to cut the heat, and the shade of the scraggly bushes did little to block the blazing sun. Gnats, mosquitoes, and flies swarmed all around, buzzing and biting. Despite the heat and bugs, the runaway slaves, filthy from head to toe, their clothes tattered and shredded by thorns and branches, their bare feet blistered and cut, slept hard, huddled together in the tall grass. As they slept, a woman, a conductor, watched and guarded over them. Even now, as they slept deeply in the bushes, this woman sat upright and alert, her sharp eyes scanning the forest and her ears listening for signs of danger. She knew the dangers all too well. Slave catchers were always searching for runaway slaves, lurking in the middle of swamps, hunting for runaways miles away from their nearest house, town, or road, hoping to catch groups of runaway slaves. The slave catchers were paid great sums of money if they caught them, and this woman knew very well that the slave catchers would never give up. This woman who stood guard over everyone else was Minty, the same Minty who used to sit by the crib hoping the plantation owner's baby would not cry. But people did not call her Minty anymore. People called her by her name, Harriet Tubman. When she grew up, Harriet Tubman did not serve in the big house. Perhaps this was because the plantation owners sensed that she was a bit rebellious. She always did things her way. So from the time she was a young woman, she was sent to work in the fields, plowing and digging, cutting hay and tobacco, and chopping wood. In time, she became as strong and tough as a person could be. When the plantation owner died, Harriet Tubman faced a new danger. It was likely that she'd be sent off to Georgia, just like her sisters. Georgia was in the deep South, where many of the plantations grew cotton, and conditions were even worse for enslaved Africans. Work on the cotton plantations was difficult, and it was performed in all types of weather. They plowed the fields with teams of mules, hoed the soil to get rid of weeds, and harvested the cotton by hand. The cotton had to be picked clean and then made into heavy bales that could be transported away from the plantation and sold. Harriet knew she needed to run away from her life in slavery. In order to reach freedom, Harriet Tubman needed to use the Underground Railroad. This was not a real railroad. It was a system of secret routes and hiding places to help enslaved people escape from slavery in the South to the freedom in the North. If only there had been a real railroad to freedom, then escaping would have been a lot easier for Harriet Tubman and other runaway slaves. They could have hopped aboard any train and ridden away from the punishments, endless work, and sorrows of harsh life. In certain ways, the Underground Railroad was like a real railroad. On a real train, there are passengers, or people who travel from one place to another. Runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad were also known as passengers, and as soon as they ran away from the plantation, they set off on an incredible and difficult journey to freedom. But runaways cannot complete this journey without help from a conductor. On a real railroad, a conductor is in charge of the train. On the Underground Railroad, a conductor guided runaway slaves, leading them through secret paths and taking them to safe houses. These safe houses were known as stations, and like real train stations, they were places where passengers could rest before moving on to the next part of their journey. Many different people provided these stations to escaping slaves. People from both the North and the South who knew slavery was wrong, and even some former enslaved Africans who had won their freedom and wanted just to help others. Harriet Tubman made it safely to freedom in the North using the Underground Railroad. Enslaved Africans like Harriet were free in the northern states like Pennsylvania, where slavery was not allowed, but they weren't entirely safe until they left the United States and entered the land north of it. This was because the laws allowed slave catchers to enter free states in the North to catch runaway slaves and return them to their life of slavery in the South. Harriet did not stay in Pennsylvania for long. She missed her family and friends and could not bear the thought of them remaining in slavery while she enjoyed a free new life. She decided she had important contributions to make to help those who were still enslaved. So, Harriet Tubman became a conductor on the Underground Railroad and returned to the South 19 more times over several years, risking her life each time to help other enslaved Africans escape to freedom. Harriet Tubman soon became one of the bravest and most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad. Her name became well known among the supporters of slavery. Plantation owners put rich rewards out for her capture. Within a few years, they wanted her stopped at all costs, but she kept going back, again and again, helping more and more enslaved people escape. Harriet was startled by the distant sound of dogs barking, and she knew danger was near. "Wake up now, wake up," she urged, shaking the men and women. "Gather up these babies, we've got to get a move on." The men and women sprang to their feet with fear and panic. "Don't you worry now," she assured them. "I know a station not too far from here, but we'll have to move fast, and we'll have to stay in the creek to keep the dogs off the trail." They hustled out of the swamp and splashed up the creek where the dogs would have a hard time following their scent. An hour later, soaked in sweat and muddy creek water, they arrived in the front yard of a small farmhouse. The runaway slaves hid in the weeds while Harriet Tubman slipped through the yard and onto the front porch. She tapped 3 times on the door, waited a moment, and then tapped 2 more times. This was a secret knock, so the people in the house would know that their visitor was an Underground Railroad conductor in need of help. A white woman opened the door. She signaled for the runaways to follow her into the chicken coop. There she lifted a trap door in the floor, revealing a dark hole. "It's not comfortable," she told them, "but nobody will find you here. I have some stew and biscuits inside and fresh milk. I'll bring it out as soon as the coast is clear." Their hearts raced as they waited in the hideout, expecting to hear the slave catcher's dogs barking any minute. But the dogs never came. Running through the creek had thrown the slave catchers off the trail, and for now, the runaways were safe. They wanted to sleep, but when the sun went down, they had to move on again. There was no time to waste, for nighttime was the only safe time to travel. Outside, Harriet Tubman looked up at the starry sky. She put her arm around one of the children. "See there," she said, pointing upward. "That group of stars there. It kind of looks like a ladle you might use to scoop water from a bucket. Back where I'm from, we used to call it a drinking gourd. Do you see it?" "I think so," the child said. "Now, see that cup of the drinking gourd?" Harriet Tubman asked. "Look at the 2 stars at the end of the cup and pretend you can draw a straight line from those 2 stars straight out into space. If you follow that line straight out, you'll find the North Star. It's always there, right in the same spot, and you can always find it if you know how to find the drinking gourd in the sky. Do you know why this star is so important?" she said. "Why?" the child asked. "Because the North Star is always to the north. If we follow the North Star every night and keep it in front of us, then it will guide us to the north for freedom." And heading to the north and to freedom is exactly what they did.